Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Midori House, the home of Monocle. I'm Robert Bound. I'm Monocle's culture editor and for Monocle 24, which is our sister radio station. And I'm joined on stage by Georgina Adam, the legendary writer on the art market, whose new book, Big Bucks, is going to... we're going to talk about some of the issues in her book. And also by Ossian Ward from the Lisson Gallery. Previously a journalist, now the head of content at Lisson. I say previously a journalist, probably still a journalist as well. Yeah. So thank you very much for coming. I wanted to talk about taste, about tastemakers, and an interesting thing when we've been talking amongst ourselves before standing up here on the stage, that it is big time buyers that are making the running in terms of taste, rather than curators and critics. And in terms of the aesthetic argument, I'll turn to you, Ossian, on this. You know, as you were the editor of Art Review previously as well, whether you feel that that critics and curators, or critics rather, have kind of lost the battle, and it's just buyers now that inform what people see.
Well, to some extent, the critics are a dying breed, although I'm sure there's many more of them than there were 50 years ago. But there's probably not as many as there are now curators and dealers and collectors and the other things. But you know, it's a bit of a lonely, solitary business being a writer. So, you know, you're kind of writing and hoping that people will listen to you. But I don't think that the critic has completely disappeared. I think people will still need criticism. I think if a work is completely critic-proof, it's kind of hermetically sealed like one of those kids' toys or a pack of batteries you can't get into, then it's probably not worth discussing. But people still need a critic. I think, you know, perhaps judging by the fact that I don't think critics really make an appearance in your book. You know, it kind of shows you to the level to which they've changed. And Dave Hickey is one of my favourite critics. I think he says in your books that the critics have become a kind of courtier class, that, you know, they're sort of advising people as much as the advisors are advising people. But I never thought about it as cheerleading. When I, you know, writing about art, I don't think about it as cheerleading. I think about it as kind of explaining or, you know, letting the work breathe, you know, telling people about what it should be about. So the idea that people should look at it and think about it and work it out for themselves is part of the deal. You know, whether or not you say it's good or bad or ugly at the end is not as important, I think, as allowing people to understand or get to grips with the work. And if that's not as important nowadays, then, you know, that's sad. But I suppose that the kind of the critic that we're talking about is the kind of Clement Greenberg type critic who can
make or break a
build
show.
or destroy an artist's reputation.
Yes.
They don't really exist anymore,
No.
I would say.
No, they have, there's no doubt. I mean, this is much more Ossian's field than mine, but there's no doubt that the critics have their influence has definitely waned in favour of collectors. I mean, some of the major collectors you know, do to an extent set the critical agenda, and unfortunately, the price does set the critical agenda. And that's purely because, I have to say, because of the press as well, is that, you know, you get a huge price that will get press coverage. Does that mean that a Klimt that sells for 135 million, does that make Klimt the best artist in the world? No, certainly doesn't. But, you know, there is a simplification going on there.
And there's an interesting thing that you bring the press into it, because it seemed that when the young British artists were gaining notoriety in the British press and in the American press, in the art press, I guess, as a whole, the discussions were about, is this art? What is this? Rather than the prices. Whereas now we're kind of like, well, yes, it is art, but whenever you open a broadsheet newspaper, there isn't art criticism in there. It's always, the headline has a lot of zeros in it, and that presumably changes everybody's idea of what contemporary art is. Well, maybe this is the time to come on to luxury goods as art, as the art market aping the structure of the luxury goods market, not just because a lot of the big buyers happen to own luxury goods brands themselves, right?
Yes, well, I mean, there is the Arnaud and Pinault aspect, yes. It's really interesting, actually, because when I started writing my book, I went out and bought the Bible of marketing luxury goods and opened it up, and really, you know, my mouth fell open, because all of the rules for marketing luxury goods are pretty well identical to the rules of what you see, the practice of selling the upper end of art. But that is the upper end. You know, our conversation today is very much about, you know, so far about that upper end, and that there is another end as well. But I think that the this aspect is very interesting. For a start, we live in a period, this century and the last century, the second half of the last century, a period of branding. Didn't exist in the same way before. And this branding has come from the luxury goods companies, who do an enormous amount to actually protect their brand, promote their brand, establish their brand as being indicative of something. It gives you, status. It shows art. Always, of course, has been used to show status and wealth and power. Look at the Hermitage Museum, or not the Hermitage, but Catherine the Great's palace, Versailles, the Medicis, always. So that's nothing new. But I think this branding aspect is very interesting, and whether consciously or unconsciously, the art world has sort of, to an extent, the upper reaches of the art market has taken on that branding aspect. So you have branded galleries like Ossian, and you have branded artists, like, the H word, Damien Hirst. Or
the H word, imagine that. Imagine your surname being used almost like a swear.
Damien Hirst, Takashi Murakami, and then, of course, very interesting. I mean, it's when you think that Takashi Murakami has designed handbags, that's the classic example, but you can cite me 40 or 50 other examples of other artists who are designing luxury goods. So the luxury goods are seeking to sort of plug into the symbolic value of art, because there's the symbolic value and then there's the monetary value of art. And the luxury goods are trying to move themselves beyond the sort of material aspect of their goods by giving it a sort of symbolic aspect. And the artists, quite frankly, and I've got nothing against artists making lots of money, not much the better, have also sort of plugged in to the luxury goods. And for example, Yayoi Kusama, who have had a big cooperation with LVMH, with Louis Vuitton. I was told by Victoria Miro, her gallerist, that that her market really exploded once they had actually done their shop windows all around the world.
Because there's visibility.
Because
it's almost an advertising campaign for an artist.
I mean, I'm not particularly promoting Kusama, but it's just an indication of how each side benefits actually from that cooperation, whether you like it or not.
And I wonder whether Murakami's Louis Vuitton sort of riffing with the logo, the Louis Vuitton logo, is that the same as Warhol's soup cans? I mean, clearly one was an ordinary FMCG and one is a luxury good. But do they sort of plough the same furrow as works of art, Ossian?
I mean, certainly the handbags wouldn't have happened without the soup cans. So it's part of the progression of art history in many ways. But I don't know. I don't quite know when it became the luxury good market as well as the contemporary art market, but I do see that we keep shifting in epochs from that time. I was kind of mistily talking about the Clement Greenberg time of critical, everyone was interested in the work and, talking about the artist. And then I suppose that Jackson Pollock, the famous kind of glossy magazine, slightly changed the role of the artist. And then, you talked about the YBAs. That seemed like really the time of the celebrity cult status artist. And it seems like now this next epoch is about the cost of it and the economics and the price and the boom, and that maybe we'll go back to that, that sort of misty-eyed time. The misty place that I imagine in my mind. But, I don't know whether that will come along with a kind of an art market crash or one of these kind of corrections in the market that everyone talks about, or whether it will happen naturally, or what the next kind of epoch will be. But I can't say whether the luxury market is affecting it for good or evil at the moment, really. I can't quite see. It's too close somehow. The Murakami, has just become a way of getting more artists to relate to that. And that worked with Warhol. Historically now, Warhol is seen as the factory, and the idea of presenting your work has become an art historical fact, an interesting one. So, we might need a bit more space to see what will happen, whether that's good or bad thing.
Of course, the artist of superstar goes really back. I mean, Schnabel and, the sort of the 1980s greed is good period, that was also a period of the artist as superstar. And then, of course, you have, a huge crash in 1990 on, and that affected it. So I think it is also linked to wealth and the economy. And that, as you say, if there's, I don't see that the art market can remain immune from the overall financial landscape of the world, shall we say.
I wanted to ask you about a specific chapter in your book, Georgina, which looks at the auction houses as, I'm going to paraphrase it badly, but it's basically from dusty booksellers to the art people, and in terms of luxury goods branding, Sotheby's and Christie's, and I guess and Phillips and all the rest, have this kind of emollient sort of, I guess, reputation now. It's this thing that they are a luxury brand themselves.
Branding, yeah.
How did that? I mean, maybe how did that come to pass? And will you ever sort of discover anything looking around an auction house that, in terms of the aesthetic, whether you can ever really appreciate something when it's you know that it's going to be shifting off this mortal coil to another collector tomorrow?
What's interesting about the auction houses, first of all, we are talking about resale at the moment in the auction houses, and I think that's important. I think a lot of you here probably will think of the market for contemporary art as being the primary market, i.e. sold by a gallery, the first sale of the artist, and the gallerist promoting that artist, sometimes for years without getting much result, but because the dealer actually believes in that artist. Whereas the auction houses, until recently, were reselling. So it is a different market, it's the secondary market. So I think it's important to make that distinction. What I think is interesting about, I mean, they are obviously branded and they drive themselves very much as brands. Christie's in particular has been extremely aggressive on the online, and that's a very interesting aspect of what's happening in the art market, is to what extent, is the internet going to expand the market, expand the knowledge of artists, which is the good thing. What I think is a bit worrying is that the trend seems to be, see, Sotheby's and Christie's in particular, for a long time they fought each other for market share. And then one day they turned around and thought, well, this is crazy. Why attack another auction house? Why don't we just attack the dealers? There's a much bigger market out there. And so there were various attempts. I mean, Horch and Benson was the example of attempting to go into the primary market. And Horch and Benson didn't work out, so that went into abeyance. There were a couple of occasions before, but basically that ended. But what I am seeing is that the auction houses now have come up with another way of doing this, which is they hold their own private selling shows. And those shows sometimes are secondary market work, but in a number of cases they are primary. So now the auction houses are actually attacking the primary. And I think this is a very dangerous trend.
Well, also the auction houses, as you say, they used to be all about old masters and, selling works from collections, but now very much it's about contemporary art. I mean, I'm not quite sure that I agree with their definition of what contemporary art is, because they used to be called post-war and contemporary sales, and now they've sort of dropped the post-war and they just call it contemporary. But those works can go back to, the 50s or 60s, and arguably we can argue about when contemporary art is or starts or not. But they consciously use that because they want to use the brand of contemporary art. They want it to seem like they're cashing in on, they're selling the contemporary art, which...
Well, because the contemporary art is the hottest, the most fashionable part of the art market, but also contemporary art is the only part of the art market that has supply. I mean, it comes down to that, and we are in a vastly expanded art market. The amount of money that's spent today compared to 20 years ago is vastly greater. As I say, emerging economies have come in, there's a great demand, and in order to satisfy demand, you have to have supply, and it's only contemporary art.
But I think of contemporary art as something much more recent than Warhol. I don't know whether you would define it as being a living artist thing or not, but that encroachment you're talking about with the auction houses coming into the gallery world, I thought you made a very good point in the book that somehow the art fairs were like that was the pushback. But the galleries then suddenly found the art fairs would be the way they could retake some of that land grab.
Well, the point is, of course, that the auction houses have got already global spread. The big auction houses, Sotheby's and Christie's particularly, because Sotheby's and Christie's really dominate that market. It's a duopoly. I mean, there are, Phillips is interesting because it's actually attacking them. But basically, Sotheby's and Christie's had that worldwide spread, and dealers, apart from the sort of handful, literally 5 or 6 mega dealers, don't have that. So obviously, if they can go and exhibit in Hong Kong, Art Basel, Hong Kong, that gives them that international reach that they don't have otherwise. It also creates an event. The art fair creates an event that is slightly now or not now or never in the same way. So it reproduces the event of the auction. The auction, you're there, do you want it, don't you want to get your hand up because the guy next door to you looks interested. And to... yes? Hi. And the art fairs do the same thing. They create this, somebody else is looking at that work, I better buy it now.
Yeah, there's a thing, there's a piece in your book where someone sees someone looking at something they've got their eye on, so they buy it immediately at an art fair.
Yes. And there's also the event
I'd love to be that guy. Yeah.
But, I mean, you know, there is that thing of it's being a bit like a supermarket, and you know, you can rush in and buy everything you need in one stop. But
you can compare. You can compare. It's quite nice if you want to buy whatever you want to buy.
Yeah, but then I also
think
think that
it's
it's a bit like supermarket shopping in that, you know, it's all there, but there's no context for it. I always feel like I need to go back to the gallery, to my local grocery shop to understand where this stuff comes from. You know, I'm not going as far back as the field where the plum was plucked, or, you know, where the fruit came from, but you kind of, when you get to the supermarket, you forget where it came from. You know, it's all been packaged, and it's quite bewildering. So in terms of, you know, looking at art, it's not a great environment, but in terms of, you know, clawing back some of that market share, it's certainly worked for, you know, the galleries. It's
obviously worked for the galleries because there are more and more art fairs. I mean, there's hardly a week when I, you know, don't have somebody get in touch with me about. But it also, I mean, the other thing is I've made it sound very commercial because it's the galleries, you know, it enables them to reach into China or Korea or wherever they want, to the Middle East. But it also does give international profile to the artists. So that, along with biennales, which also have been very important, that's exploded as well, the number of biennales in the world.
And they're not just for show, they're for sale as well, the biennale.
Yes, biennales are for show. They are are for selling as well as. But yes, but you know, sometimes it is a little bit different, and things can be shown in a biennale. I mean, for example, you see an enormous amount of video work in biennales, huge amount, which you don't see in an art fair. Video works are much more difficult to sell. So I think it does give a platform.
I should just say we're going to speak for about 20 more minutes, and then we're going to take questions from the floor. You're the floor. I should have said that at the beginning, but if there's any burning inquiry that you'd like to pose to Georgina or Ossian, we'll do that bit at the end. And I wanted to start a new line of inquiry, I guess. You mentioned Christie's was very strong online. I'd like to sort of talk about the online element of it. This is obviously how luxury goods brands do a lot of their business these days.
Well, they don't sell over the internet. You can't buy your hat.
But I suppose it's.
But you establish.
It's diffusion, isn't it?
Yes. Well, the diffusion, yes, which of course some of the big artists do as well.
And I wanted to ask Ossian about this because in his book he talks about the fact that you have to see a work of art in the flesh, in the canvas, to really experience it. How does that work when we hear that so many works of art, big expensive works of art, are sold on the basis of an art advisor showing someone a JPEG on an iPhone? How does this work?
Well, I would think before you spent lots of money on a JPEG, you would have done your research. So you would have sort of
not actually a JPEG.
Yeah, well, exactly. You would have substantiated, you know, done a bit of background work. Maybe not, but you know, I tend to think that kind of work, you know, would have been bolstered by seeing the work somewhere else or knowing the artist, you know. And I think to some extent, you know, you were talking about the market for work online. I think two-dimensional work, photography, you know, things that can easily be viewed online, that's one thing that you can do successfully. But really, a lot of the work that we're seeing being made today, let's say some of the more ambitious work, the kind of stuff that you have to be there to see, is because it's work that surrounds you. It's not necessarily 2D, it's 3D, it's sculpture, it's performance, it's installation. And that doesn't work on a JPEG. I mean, you know, it can be bought and sold and traded like anything else. But I think that's the situation in which you need to see something. You can't really judge a work of art from a flat picture. But then it's also a distribution network for artists now. So one of the artists I mentioned in the book, who also happens to be a Lisson gallery artist, is Corey Archangel, who made this wonderful piece with cats playing pianos. And they're just internet cats. You know, we all love an internet cat. And he found a program to take the notes from each of the cat playing pieces and turn them into a very famous piece of atonal Schoenberg music, which gave it this kind of avant-garde cats playing piano idea. So, that's something that can be appreciated immediately, online. It's made for the medium. But it also has something deeper. It has a deep history about music and, but it's very contemporary. So I think that the internet can be that place. It can be the marketplace. It can be a place of new production, but it shouldn't be the only way you experience art. I think that would be deeply sad.
And sad, and also I think that somebody once said to me, you can see somebody on Skype and you can talk to them and you can see them move, but it's not the same as meeting the person, actually meeting them in the flesh. And I think that's true of art. I think your experience of an artwork, you do actually have to be in its presence. As you say, I'm not talking about photography, for example, or prints or something like that, but it's something a little bit more complex or very much more expensive. I would assume that the person who would buy it having actually physically seen it.
But then I wonder if the commercial affects the aesthetic in that sense, that if online is becoming a popular way to buy, then necessarily the parameters of that work of art, the thing that can easily hang over your fireplace, it's an easily understandable two-dimensional picture, whether that changes, whether it makes art more conservative, if you know what I mean. Whereas people you can't have a discussion, you can't interrogate this thing because it only exists online.
You're making it sound like online dating now, that you kind of make up your mind immediately. And I think in a high-pressured environment, in an art fair, you might do that. But, if art were like speed dating, you need the time to get to know the other person. It's like a relationship with a work of art. You have to figure out whether they're any good or not. You have to look for their good qualities or bad qualities. And that's something that I tried to work through in the book as a way of trusting your own judgment, really, because I did say that critics are a dying breed, but actually, in many ways, everyone's a critic now. Everyone can have their opinion, and that can be valid. Everyone should be able to make up their own mind about a work of art and judge it for who it is. And if it's all about speed dating, I don't think you get the idea that you have to build up some rapport with a work of art, because we've all been there. You're confronted with something in a room. You don't know quite what to make of it. Do you go back and read some text, or I think the idea is that we should all be able to look at these works and make something from them, whether it's we don't get the exact meaning the first time, or whether we're still confused by it, days later. But the idea that I've explored in my book is that everyone should have that opportunity. You shouldn't feel excluded from that conversation. You shouldn't feel like contemporary art is for an elite audience, or it's only for the collector or only for the critic or the curator. So the idea that we can all, have that one-night stand with a work of art should be, we should be...
More mixed metaphors in Ossian.
That's true. Yeah, but I think that this that there are different motivations, and if somebody's buying what sometimes the Americans call over the couch, i.e. they've got a blue couch and they want a blue painting, that's a completely different motivation, and they're decorating their home, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, that's fine. But it's different if you're trying to engage with contemporary art, contemporary creation, try to understand what an artist is doing. So, I don't think you can dump this all in the same, selling art over the internet.
I wanted to ask you about critics' jobs again. I wanted to go back to that. I interviewed Sean Scully, the abstract painter, a couple of weeks ago, and I said, do you find it that people don't ask you enough straight questions? That maybe arts journalists don't ask him enough straight questions. No one asks, why is it blue? And he told me that he painted a work in the early 80s, I think, called This, That, and it's a huge yellow canvas. And he said he was painting it in his studio in New York. It was a huge thing, and halfway through and he was painting it red. It was a bright red thing, and halfway through it fell on him, and he said, imagine being wrestled to the ground by an angry, wet bed, because it was such a huge canvas. And so to get his own back on it, he repainted it yellow. And that's the reason why that canvas is yellow. And I said, I wouldn't have asked you that. I wouldn't have got that information out of you unless I'd asked you a very straight question. And I guess this is a question for you, Ossian, whether there is enough straight talking, and this is more an aesthetic, critical question. In your book, you talk about the fact that there's too much art speak surrounding contemporary art. I wonder how much of it is necessary and how much of that art speak is superfluous.
Well, you did well to get that out, Sean Scully. I didn't know he was such a willing interviewee. I mean, a lot of artists don't want to give away the secrets, whether the secrets are actually not so much a secret but an anecdote. You know, I think quite often, if you're a critic, you tend to go in blind, and I suppose that's the idea of the book as well, that you have to kind of clear your mind and do your own work. Because if an artist tells you something, it might be elucidating, or it could be really annoying. Like, you know, they could tell you the thing that most annoys you about the work is suddenly you lose all faith in it suddenly. So the artist is not always to be trusted in these situations, because some artists don't talk about their work very well. Some people don't want to tell you that you know it fell on their head and that's why it, you know, ended up yellow. So the critic has to make some assumptions and judgments, and I think that you can do that without recourse to the really complicated language of art theory, because you know, if you've got that education, if you've got that background, if you've got that knowledge and that toolkit, then that's great, and you can take the work sort of further. But I think for most people who are coming to a work, they need to start a bit, you know, closer to home. They don't want to go straight into serious theory or philosophy. I don't think they feel alienated by that, and so do I. You know, I've been studying it and reading it and doing all that kind of stuff, you know, for the last 20, 30 years, and I still find a lot of it difficult and hard work. And I don't think it has to be. I think you can start from a position of interest, and you know, something will grab you and make you want to read more about it, and that's when you kind of get to the next level. But if you're confronted by a text that immediately puts you off, I don't think that's helping anyone. It's not helping the artist, and it's not helping the gallery, it's not helping the audience.
I totally agree, and I think that an awful lot of art writing is really so obscure. I think sort of critical discourse, and a lot of magazines are guilty. I'm sorry, but you know, I just think that more clarity, and I think in a way it serves to sort of ring fence the contemporary art world and make it seem very arcane and difficult, and I think it's really doing a disservice to the contemporary art world, because I think if people could understand better. It's not easy to understand contemporary art.
Yeah.
A lot of, you know, you're faced with something and you really don't know what's going on at all. And if on top of that, the piece of paper you pick up in the gallery and it's incomprehensible, I think it's such a pity. I wish art writing was clearer and more direct and more understandable and less obscure.
Yeah, I'm guilty of this, by the way, as well.
Your book isn't.
I'm not putting myself out of this, but you know, there is a further kind of educational role that writing can have, and if you're an academic and you really know your stuff, you can expand the knowledge on an artist or a movement, you know, incredibly. But I think to start from that starting point can put you off for life. You know, you can think, no, I'm never going to get this. But you know, like I said, the artist may not be the one to help you. Sometimes you have to trust yourself. You know, I often do that thing, you know, of having come to the conclusion of whether or not I like something. I mean, that's the critic's job. It's not necessarily everyone's, you know, be-all and end-all to say whether something's good or bad. But you did remind me with Sean Scully, I always have to be a bit careful about which artists I meet in case I've written something horrible about them. Oh, is he? All right, well, I will make sure not to cross him.
And we're slightly playing hopscotch with our topics here, because there's something I forgot to ask both of you right at the beginning, actually, which was about, we talked about this, actually, in the run-up to today, which was about flipping, which is obviously a massive preoccupation of the art market. So, Georgina, I'll come to you first, and maybe you can define what that means and what it does.
Yeah, well, flipping's terrible, really. It's pure speculation. And it's people generally who have the wherewithal to buy up, for example, a whole show. So they sort of, corner the market. And then they tip it into, they sort of create heat around the name of this artist because the show was sold out, and then they flip the lot into auction. It's speculation. It's terrible for the artists because they suddenly, I mean, they're sitting in their studio doing their work, and all of a sudden their show's bought out, and then, you know, 6 months or a year later, it's all much more expensive, and everyone's talking about them. The classic cases. This guy did the silver, J. Vicate, classic case, but now there's a whole bunch of them, Ostrovsky, and then there's one who's called Uapur or Nurpur or Kurpur, and these, you know, there's an enormous amount. It's quite interesting, actually, because quite often the works themselves are quite neutral, which is quite an interesting aspect. It's a sort of...
It's like decorating a house for rent.
It is a bit.
Yeah.
It's a bit like that. They've not got much going on. Okay, they've got some sort of a winkle, that they've incorporated sort of... Well, the other case, of course, is the Murillo. He's incorporated dirt into his. So there's this thing that, these big abstracts, which can go pretty well everywhere, reasonably easily transportable. You create a buzz and then... But it's tough for the artist because Cassé, now what does he do next? I think it's very destructive.
And there's the aesthetic argument in that as well, that someone is overexposed and then the market, they're yesterday's news, and that can kill you. Artists are sensitive people, right? We shouldn't be forgetting that.
Yeah, and I think that their work can suffer as a result of overproduction and the pressure on the artist to then suddenly fulfill all these amazing offers that they've had. And often that's when either the artist or the work kind of gets left behind, and there's this kind of overarching reputation floating above him, which doesn't do him any favours particularly. But I think, it's interesting what you're talking about, that neutral aspect to it, that it's not necessarily challenging stuff. It's stuff that is quite easy on the eye, quite easy to look at and collect and consume and enjoy. But the fear is then that you create a sort of bubble around a fairly uninteresting type of work. And one of my favourite art critics, Jerry Saltz, calls it zombie formalism, because it's the idea that you're just sort of producing the same sort of work. Everyone's now doing bubbles, or everyone's now doing silver works, or everyone's doing, this kind of, formulaic thing, which becomes a little market in its own right. But I think the thing is, if you get a good show of one of those, they might turn out to be great. You might actually, stand in a room full of these things and find there's something to enjoy. If you see one of them on an art fair booth, you're not likely to fall in love with them. Or, you're just going to think, why is that there for £100,000? But if you are surrounded by them and you're in the artist world, then, maybe it does make sense. Maybe there is something there. But we often don't get to find out. We just get to hear the big, shocking headline, and, then we all sort of get grumpy about it. But I think if we were to look at it and, really have a dialogue with it, then... maybe they're smarter than we think. Maybe they know what they're doing. Maybe it's not all a bubble. Maybe these guys are geniuses. But we will never know because it's not given the chance, I think.
Well, they're not given the chance to progress either, really, are they? The artists themselves, because how can they progress when they've started and they've got people banging on their door wanting more of this? So I think it blocks the artist as well.
I wonder if we should maybe talk before we finish about art fair art and whether art is becoming what you think it is when you're a kid. Is becoming purely decorative. It's purely something that looks nice. I mean, I'm thinking of maybe balloon dogs and huge things that are wrapped up like gifts that cost a huge amount to maybe produce, and so they sell for $40 million. Are these things just purely decorative? I wonder if they've lost the idea that there is an argument in contemporary art at all. Ossian?
I don't know. I don't know if I agree with your category of art fair art, because I think that art fair art is things that are taken from an artist studio, or because they're of a certain size and they're manageable. And in fact, artists have to produce a certain amount of work to keep going anyway. Because I think if you want to create more ambitious work, or you want to do the thing in the museum that you've always dreamed of, you still need to somehow fund that. So you often fund your own practice by doing the art fair art. But I do often think that it's part of your practice as an artist to make. If you make smaller things and more sellable things, more commercial things, then they're the ones that go to the art fair, and hopefully they're the ones that help fund your more ambitious, crazy idea that no one would ever possibly want to purchase because it's such a difficult work that you're envisaging. So I don't think it forms just a purely decorative function. It's a complex system in which the art fairs, yes, they do cater to that taste. Yes, the things are small and easy to consume. But I think that you can still support an artist and support their career through an art fair. You can actually back the right artist. You can back the right gallery. I think you can do all of those things without feeling like you're just part of this feeding frenzy. They do have. You don't see it because an art fair doesn't feel curated or sort of easy to manage. But there's more nuanced things than just I need something for my couch or whatever.
I agree. And don't forget, you have Art Unlimited at Art Basel, which is those oversized pieces. Some of them are really colossal, and that definitely is not domestically sized, easy to carry away and stick over your mantelpiece. So, you know, you can
You
really...
should see some of these
and
people's
those are
houses.
curated. Yeah, yes, quite. Or the museums that they're going to go into. But that's curated. And then you have also the projects in art fairs, which can sometimes, I mean, like Nelson, that did that wonderful thing in Frieze. So not everything in an art fair is easy to carry away, and, you know.
Well, we've kind of come to the end of our time. At least us guys talking on stage. Does anybody have any questions for Georgina or Ossian about cats playing pianos, zombie formalism, or the mysteries of the art market? I wonder.
Yeah, you were talking about philosophy being sometimes a bit complicated. There's that guy called Ludwig Wittgenstein. To him, aesthetics and ethics were one and the same. He might be forgiven at his time to think that maybe, but today it looks like there's no more ethics potentially, or maybe the art world has co-evoluted with the general environment, and the ethics of the day is the supermarket and the money world and this kind of thing. So do you see this as the end of art history, or do you think maybe pushing it to an extreme would bring some sort of creative destruction? People would go back to, I don't want something that's got a value to be exchanged. I want to know what the artist himself, I want something a bit more absolute rather than a relative thing that everybody can like instantly.
I'm no Wittgenstein expert, but I think the idea of ethics is very important. I think it possibly is one of the things that's getting lost, along with philosophy and many other things. But in some way, ethics does rear its head in the kind of socially inclusive work. We talk about relational art or works, kind of performance art, which I think is doing that job of trying to work out what art's purpose is today. So there are maybe many different kinds of contemporary art. There's the kind that you can easily buy and sell and trade, and then there's the kind of work that exists in the mind, or exists in an audience, or exists in a short period of time. And I think that's the kind of work perhaps that will hold on to some of those ethics. I think if you just believed that it was all diamond skulls and luxury objects, then you would be in that kind of pit of despair of that there's no ethics in the art world. But you also have to think there are a lot of people who are doing work that is socially inclusive or includes different types of audiences. It's not necessarily made for the art fair or the auction house, and that's where you'll find the ethics. I can't give you a concrete example of who I think.
I can think of one. When I went out to the Jumex Museum in Mexico last year, and out in the previous area where it was, they have a Danish artist whose name I cannot remember. And that was very interesting because it was completely engaged with the community, and part of his artwork was also creating, I can't remember exactly how it worked, but it was some way of creating electricity for people who didn't have electricity. And he had a huge program to go out to the favelas out there, out in Mexico City, which of course colossal. I mean, it's just horrendous. Superflex, that's it. Yeah. Well done. Thank you very much. So that was socially engaged art. So I think, I always think it's very dangerous to say the end of anything, really. I think that's quite, it's in our time, the end of history, the end of the art market, the end of the art world. I think it will survive through us and beyond us. It'll change, but it'll still be there.
Madam.
Thank you. Actually, that fits perfectly with my question, which is about Latin American art. And I don't know whether you agree, but it seems to me that there is a kind of rediscovery of Latin American art. It's very much in all the museums here in London, with the radical geometry in the Royal Academy, Pangea at Saatchi, and...
Christie's had a great exhibition as well, which had a lot of Latin American art, kinetic art.
Exactly. So my question is, why now? What happened in Latin America now that didn't happen before? What was that switch?
Well, there are still major problems in the Latin American market. Talk about the market, which is tax. There's huge taxes to pay if you import art. So they have been domestic markets to a large extent. And this is something that the art galleries, the two main markets is Brazil and Mexico. Those are the two biggest. And as we know, Argentina's got fantastic financial problems, monetary problems, so it's really not a player. But this, I think, has, plus the periods of dictatorship that went up into the 80s, and I think all of these were reasons why it wasn't able to take its place, so they remained more domestic. But
so there's very much a market
it's
element rather than an aesthetic element to that.
It's not an aesthetic thing, it's purely nuts and bolts. And also, of course, the fact that Art Basel Miami Beach was established, which was, of course, a way of plugging into the Latin American market, also gave more. And now there's a curator at the Met, I think, is it all MoMA, there's the curator of Latin American art, the Estrela Brodsky curator. So, you know, there's considerable interest, but it was a fiscal problem, and this fiscal problem still exists. If you buy a work of art from abroad, you have to pay, I think, virtually double the price. So that discouraged collectors. Of course, that is not necessarily Latin American artists, those are international artists, but it's all part of the whole interest in what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And gentleman there with the white shirt.
So something we haven't really talked about yet is the relationship between private collectors and public institutions. Now, I know in Georgina's book, she starts to talk about how collectors may get their way onto a museum board by donating or buying their way onto it, whichever way you'd like to see it. How healthy do you think that relationship is at the moment?
Well, anything that gets art into museums, and you know, the big problem is that public budgets are being shrunk all the time, aren't they? I mean, this is a big problem. And there's this thing that's happening is that public institutions are seeing their endowments, their acquisition budgets shrink, and private museums have got lots and lots of money, you know, if it's funded by somebody. Is it a bad thing if somebody joins the Latin American Acquisition Committee of Tate, say, and enables Tate to buy Latin American art, which diffuses the knowledge of Latin American artists, even if the motivation isn't, you know, is sometimes a bit commercial. The fact is, you know, the result is there. So I think it's great that museums are able to use this method of increasing the spread of what they're showing, particularly since their own acquisition budgets are tending to be shrunk all the time. I mean, there's a greater interest there. Is you know, where is this finally going? What is finally going to happen? Are the private museums going to sort of completely take over as tastemakers? I mean, when we come back to who's setting the critical agenda, you know, to what extent does the private museum, which is funded by one person and who may have an agenda of his own, you know, if they become so powerful that they can buy up all the, you know, the best, depending how you interpret best, and public institutions, you know, are less and less able to do things. I'm no expert on public policy, so I don't know. Have you got an opinion?
Yeah, you're talking about people going on the board and putting on a show of works that they own a lot of works of, and then putting those works on the market.
Well, that's a different matter. Yes, no, I was thinking you were talking about the acquisition committees towards artists that, yes, sorry, I'm with that. Yes, I mean, I think that is something public institutions have to be very careful of. And they do, you know, I do outline it in my book. I do talk about that, and that is problematic. And it's something that institutions have to be wary of. But institutions belong in general to either a museums association or the American, the American Art Music Association of Art Museum Directors. And there are some checks and balances, although they tend to be a bit of a toothless tiger, those things. But for example, Croydon recently sold a collection, and they got themselves knocked off the Museums Association, I think it was, because they're not supposed to turn the things that they have into money, which they're then going to spend on something else. So, that's perhaps not a huge sanction, but it does mean that further down the line they may not be able to borrow from somebody else, that they may not get charitable status. So, there are ways that exist already of making sure that, trying to keep museums within some sort of an ethical line.
As an artist, I think what Ossian said about having to make sort of more practical work anyway to fund the more interesting stuff is a bit of a depressing thought, and I'd perhaps rather be a starving artist. But I think could you comment on the role of public funding in commissioning work and its relation to the art market? And could you maybe comment on the difference between markets and places where there's more of a lack of public funding, whereas in England and the UK there's a history of the Arts Council funding really interesting stuff, and perhaps in North America there isn't these kind of public funding bodies, and what the difference in qualities or perhaps aesthetics could be.
I think I didn't want to suggest that, artists have to fund their own careers through art fairs. I just meant that the art fair was not solely a place just to buy and sell, that it could also feed into the ecosystem. But what you're talking about is interesting in terms of funding. And yes, public funding is one route, and is a hard route, and is a bureaucratic route, and is, perhaps a dwindling route. But like you said, that's where a lot of the more interesting work perhaps gets made, because it's something that requires a certain amount of commitment and perhaps amount of time, amount of research, whatever. So that's important. But let's not forget there are a lot of philanthropic private museums who are also helping to fund artists. So it's not necessarily that we have to rely on the dwindling public purse, that there could be this kind of mixed economy, which you already have in America and which increasingly we're going towards today. So it's not to say that all the collectors and the private museums are doing it for their own benefit. There are also philanthropic people, and indeed the museums are part funded by these kind of philanthropic bursaries. So for an artist to be able to expand their career, they kind of have to use all those tools. You don't just have to sell work to survive. You might have to do another job, or whatever it takes to make the work is what you'll do. Whether you're starving or superstar or not, you'll still hopefully find the funding somewhere. It doesn't necessarily have to come from a public body anymore. And I think that's the understanding that we all have to be more nimble in where this kind of money comes from, because the artist can't do it just without any support. It's impossible.
One more question, I think.
Going back to the flipping thing, it seems almost that the problem you describe isn't just some artists' works being flipped, but you have, Georgina, you describe in your book a situation where the art market has changed beyond recognition in the last 20 years. And presumably that kind of pressure on, say, the top 50, top 100 artists to produce to that level, and equally for the galleries to do that many art fairs, seems like it may have a pernicious effect on the artwork. And certainly there's a level of criticism and worry that, artists are kind of brought to that level, and then how do they sustain it? So I wondered whether, as a critic, you should be sort of what one can do to combat that and try and sort of influence, other artworks, because there are a host of artworks which I was struck by the way you described them as being underneath, but actually it's a choice by artists. They don't all set out to make millions and millions of pounds. A lot of people are dealing in works which are immaterial, which are performative, or, and so it's interesting the way that looking through the art market perspective sort of occludes all these other judgments about a work of art. And just interested in that role of, how does one support, or how does one engage, and how does one stop an art market or an art world from being completely schizophrenic between works which are worth hundreds of millions and others which are worth nothing?
No pressure.
No pressure whatsoever. Well, I really don't know how to answer that. But we do live, obviously, in a liberal economy.
It's about supply again, as you said.
It's about supply, and it exists. It only concerns us. So there's two different things. There's the young artists whose work is brought up en masse by, for example, this chap Simonovic. What's his name? Simovic. It doesn't apply to all artists by any means, and in a way you could sort of think, well, I'm jolly lucky for him in a way, but I think ultimately it's destructive. Then you have obviously what's going on at the very top, which is a market which is completely controlled by the big galleries. Jeff Koons, none of us are going to be able to pitch up into Gagosian and buy a Koons, let's face it. So that's working in a completely closed circuit. And then there's the art market at large, which is running on sort of pretty well normal rules. I think that's just all part of the fact that, as I said at the very beginning, the art market is not actually just one room, it's a whole series of rooms and lots of different things are going on. You can rail about it, that's the way it is.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. There is a sort of mixed economy. Perhaps we've been even though we're good friends, we've been sort of operating at both ends of the scale. You know, my book's sort of about the works that you can go and feel and experience and be part of, and Georgina's book's about the works that are acquired and bought and sold, and it seems very stark, like there's no middle ground, but of course there's middle ground.
There's plenty of middle ground,
and there's many
yes.
different kinds of markets, you know, there's many different kinds of strata in between, none of which are, you know, more important than others. I suppose the idea that you can look at work of art and understand it and support it, engage with it, will also make sure that more of that kind of work gets made. You know, we are in a period of time where people are expecting to come to a museum to see a big show, a big spectacle. You know, they're not coming to look at small, expensive works of art because of their price. They want to be wowed, and they want to be interested, and they want to be engaged. And that's also the kind of work that's getting made. And perhaps there's different ways of judging success. It's not necessarily all about price. It could be, you know, visitors. It could be footfall in a museum. That may be how they judge their success of an artwork. You know, if you look at something immaterial, like obvious one like Oliver Eliasson's Son at Tate Modern, you know, arguably very successful work, but not something you can commercialise or put a figure on.
Final question.
There's a comment, actually, rather than a question. I think just one point. I think there is a role that is taken very seriously by gallerists and some individual artists who aren't represented. They scrutinise buyers. And I'm an advisor, and I'm asked all the time, who is the buyer? Is there any chance they might flip? What do they have in their collection? So I do think that the question of flipping is being addressed. It's very hard to do it successfully, but I think there is a certain amount of attention that is paid to it, which is possible for galleries to exercise.
Well, yes, and in fact, Rob, this was one of the, when we were talking about this ahead of time, I think you even mentioned this, you know, whether the galleries are controlling a market by trying to prevent flipping, or whether they're, you know, controlling the market in order to better promote the artist by making sure the works go into good collections. And I think it's a bit of both. I mean, you know, I think that they do, and they do obviously want to try, if possible, to place works in a good collection, because that enhances the reputation of the artist. And I think they also do, I mean, you know, resale agreements, for example. A lot of galleries ask buyers to write resale agreements, agreeing to offer back a work of art first to the gallery before attempting to sell it anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I want to read the last sentence I said to Georgina and Ossian that I sent on the email, and I sent them some of the questions that I'd like to ask them, which was, hope this isn't too gloomy. It'll seem less so live. So I hope it hasn't seemed gloomy. Thank you very much all for coming. Thank you to those that asked questions for your questions. I can say I can give no greater recommendation for further reading than both Ossian and Georgina's books, which are over there for sale, and they'll be signing them. And thank you very much for coming.